I've said this many times to people, and I think you've heard me say personally, that when Luke wrote his second volume, volume number 2, which we call Actions, literally that's the word, the actions of the apostles, that primarily it's about two people. It's about Peter in chapters 1 through 12, and it's about Paul from chapters 9 through 28. And the reason that he wrote this book is a transitional book, but primarily he wants to convince his readers, primarily Theophilus, but anybody else who reads it, which is me and you, that Peter is legit, even though he comes to the table with a couple of strikes against him. Everyone knew that publicly he had denied Jesus. That news had spread throughout the countryside, and now Jesus appoints him to be the apostle to the Jews, and people would naturally say what? To someone who had denied Jesus publicly, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and then cursed. What would you say in response to hearing that he would now be the apostle to the Jews of the good news? What would you say? You got the wrong guy. Why did you choose me? I never denied him. So why is Acts 1 through 12 written? It's to show that Peter is like Jesus. And Peter reproduces what Jesus did. Jesus' miracle of healing a man who was lame from his mother's womb. Peter's first miracle in Acts 3 is to heal what? A man who had been lame from his mother's womb. Jesus gave the Spirit, and Peter gave the Spirit to the Samaritans in Acts chapter 8. Jesus raises the dead, and Peter raises Dorcas, or Tabitha, from the dead. And so the reader could say, oh, I get it. Peter, yeah, he's done some stupid things.
Thanks, Justin. You're trying to decide whether to stop.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Peter.
Am I on?
Yeah.
So Peter is, yes, he's legit. He's Jesus' handpicked apostle to the Jews. Now, why did he write about Paul? What did Paul come to the table with? What did he come to the table with? Saul of Tarsus.
Nothing good.
Persecution of the church.
Yeah, he's known as a murderer. He's known as hostile, an enemy of the church. And so what would people naturally say when Paul tried to join them? What would he say? What would they say to him?
Get out of here.
Yeah, we know your background, man. You got a record. You know, I looked up online. I Googled your name. And you just got this long rap sheet, dude. So what does Luke do in Acts 9 through 28? What does he do? He shows us that whatever Jesus did, Saul of Tarsus did. And Saul of Tarsus does the exact same things that Jesus does. Everything that happened to Jesus happened to Saul or Paul. One story is the story that we'll look at this morning. We're going to look at Jesus who healed a woman of a fever. She's a mother-in-law. And we're going to read in just a moment that Paul healed a man, a father, of the same kind of fever. Luke's point is what? Is that Saul of Tarsus, even though he came to the table with 2 strikes against him, facing fast pitches and curveballs and knuckleballs, that Saul is legit. That's what Acts is about. It's saying that Peter and Paul are legit. The book is not about missions. The book is about the legitimacy of what? 2 men who are going to carry on the task. So let's have a look at that. Acts 28. Acts 28. Are you there? If you're not, go ahead and try to find rustling pages. Acts 28. Once we were safely on shore, that's Luke, is part of the journey. We found out that the island was called Malta. This is after a shipwreck. Acts 27, by the way, is the story of Paul in the shipwreck going down into the water and being raised up out of the water just like a death and resurrection from the dead. And he ends up on this island for 3 months, just like Jesus, who ends up in the grave for 3 days. The island was called Melita, actually, in Greek, Melita. And the barbarians, that's the word that Luke uses to describe these people, but it's not a denigration of these people. Barbarian simply means you don't know Greek, or you're not Greek. You're not educated. They welcomed us with kindness, and they built a fire, and they welcomed us because it was cold and it was raining. And so Paul gathered a pile of brushwood and he put it on the fire. And as he did it, a viper. This viper is a well-known snake that's very poisonous. Was driven out by the heat and fastened itself on Paul's hand. And when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "The man must be a murderer, because even though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire. Notice he uses a different word. He doesn't say viper, he uses a second word, a snake, into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up and die, and suddenly fall over dead. But after waiting a long time, and seeing nothing usual happen to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. By the way, that paragraph is a reminder of what happened to Jesus in the upper room when he appeared to his apostles. The focus on this paragraph is on Paul's hands. What was the focus in the upper room when Jesus was raised from the dead? What does Luke focus on? His hands. There was an estate nearby, and it belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home, and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His dad was sick in bed, suffering from a high fever and dysentery. So Paul went in to see him, and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. And when this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, that is, for Rome, they furnished us with the supplies that we need. This story, late in the game, almost as Paul arrives at Rome, once again underscores Luke's point. Saul of Tarsus, once an enemy, now an apostle, is like Jesus. Like Jesus, who healed a fever from a mother, Paul heals a fever of a father. All right, pray with me, and we'll look into another passage. Our loving Father, we gather in the name of your Son to celebrate the gospel and to celebrate the grace of God and to love one another, to meet one another, to fellowship with one another. It's been great. These are our brothers and sisters. We feel at one with them. We share a common bond. We share scars and wounds. We share a future hope. We share the feelings that are involved in a new birth, much like Ben and Candace are feeling with the birth of a new son. And we pray your blessing on him as well as on Tim, Burkett's little son. And pray that your hands would be upon them for whatever need they have. We also come perhaps with people in our midst who are suffering from some kind of a fever. The fever perhaps of discontent in their marriage, or the fever of bitterness towards someone in their past, even in their family. Perhaps there are those here who are discontent with you, discontent with the lot that they have been given in life. There are those who are suffering from unforgiveness, and it's like a root developing into bitterness, and it spreads into the family, it spreads into the children, into the spouse, and the people at work. There are all sorts of fevers, perhaps represented here, or in friends that we have. There are people who are in bed today, or at home, suffering from some kind of a spiritual fever, who ought to be here, fellowshipping and worshiping, but they're not. They're suffering from some sort of fever that they contracted perhaps some months ago or some years ago. And we pray today that you would equip us to know how to pray for such people and how to bring Jesus into their lives so that he can command that fever to be gone, to sprout legs, and to leave. Lord, you are the fever cure. You've shown it. You've proven it. And we are the people with the fevers. We know how weak it makes us and how we want to just lie down and not do anything. Invigorate us and strengthen us and equip us to know how to deal with people who are afflicted with the fevers of this life. In this we pray for Jesus' sake. I met Sid Bellamy when I was pastoring in Canada. Sid had signed up and enlisted in the Army when World War II broke out and was trained at boot camp near where my father was trained, sent to England, was further equipped, and on D-Day, the day of invasion, June the 6th, 1944, Sid and thousands of other troops landed on what is known as Juno Beach. Now, if you're an American, you know that there were two American beaches, Omaha and Utah. There were two British beaches, Gold and Sword, and then there was a fifth beach called Juno Beach, and it's where the Canadian armies hit the beach and went inland, capturing pillboxes and taking prisoners of war. Unfortunately, Sid and the rest of his squad were captured by German troops. And after 3 weeks of hitting the beach, Sid ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And he set out to war in uniform, trained to fight, but now seated on the bench, waiting for the war to end, waiting for someone to come along and free him. When Jesus traveled throughout Galilee, in Luke chapter 4 and chapter 5, he encountered prisoner of war camps. Now, don't think of the word camp as summer camp, where you have swimming and horseshoes and archery and riding horses. Prisoner of war camp is not summer camp. When Jesus walked through the streets and the alleys of Galilee, he discovered that synagogues and homes and families and marriages were like prisoner of war camps. There was people confined in those synagogues and in those homes and in those marriages, those cities and those villages with fevers. He found them captured by various types of fevers. And Luke shows us that there is no fever, there is no form of sickness or illness that Jesus cannot free us from. And he encountered, after his visit to a synagogue next door, he encountered a woman with a fever. And Luke's point in this passage that we're going to look at, Luke 4, 38 to 41, is that Jesus can put us back on our feet. Jesus can take people who are bedridden at home when they should be in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he can bring them to their feet. And having brought them to their feet, he can put them back into service. So I want you to think about someone right now as we read the text, Luke 4, 38 to 41. I know it's a short passage. It's two little paragraphs, and they're bumper to bumper. They're juxtaposed to each other for a reason, and I'll get into that in a moment. But who comes to your mind this morning that's missing in action this morning? Who comes to your mind that ought to be in a place of worship, like a synagogue or a sanctuary? Who comes to your mind today who is sick with a fever, some fever of bitterness or discontentment, or caught up in materialism, or caught up in unforgiveness, and is right now in prison, waiting for someone more powerful? Think of that as we go through this passage, and ask the Lord a couple of things. Lord, place your hands on that person. Or, secondly, free that person up, that man or woman, or that teenage boy or girl. Free them up so that they too can once again begin to serve. As I look at the passage, it's helpful for me to tell you, I think, and helpful for you to hear it, is that Luke, being a doctor, when he writes this story, is so different from Mark's gospel, for example. We've gone through Mark's gospel some years ago in terms of this passage, but this passage is written by a doctor, and it's so obvious. He uses technical terms for the sicknesses, and he focuses on the human body like no one else does. For example, the first part of this story, 38 and 39, focuses on our feet and legs without saying them, and he focuses on the word to stand, like what I'm doing right now. Now, we know that in scientific terms, we are called Homo erectus. What does that mean? Homo erectus. That means that we are Homo sapiens, we are human beings, and that we stand erect. We're not like your friendly cat or your dog that has 4 legs and walks around on 4 legs and has a tail. We are Homo erectus. We are made to walk. That's because, being made in the image of God, God is a walking God. God is not a sitting God. God is a walking God, as he is pictured in Genesis 3. He used to walk in the garden in the evening. That would be with our parents, our first father and our mother. We are Homo erectus. We are people with legs. But when we are confined to bed in sickness, with illness, we're crippled, we're paraplegics. That is the effect of sin. Sin defaces us, defigures us, dehumanizes us, degrades us. It's not the way we're supposed to be. Now, all of us do sleep, but we don't sleep to sleep. We sleep to get back up on our feet. Now, some of you think it's the other way around. You work and stand so that you can go to sleep. But for humans, we are made to walk, and we sleep in order that we might walk. The second half of the passage, Luke takes his camera and focuses it on hands. Jesus' hands. Do you see how he connects the two passages? The first half of the passage, legs, and then hands. That's surely a doctor writing the passage. Let me show you the proof of what I'm talking about. It's very plain here in my Greek text. Verse 38. Jesus is in the synagogue, probably seated in the teacher's seat. How does Luke begin the passage? It says, he stood up. Your Bible probably doesn't say that, but that's the word, stasis. He stood up. He went from the synagogue, where he dealt with the man with the unclean spirit, and he went into the house of Simon. That's the guy that we know as Simon Peter, but Simon Peter is not a disciple yet. He won't be a disciple till chapter 5 when Jesus calls him. In fact, he's the only disciple that Jesus calls in the Gospel of Luke. And his mother-in-law, did you know Pete was married? Yes. You have to be married to have a mother-in-law. How many know that that's true? All right? I know that in larger religious circles, Peter was not married, but Peter is definitely married. Simon's mother-in-law was in the grip, that's the word, in the grip of a mega fever. That's the word, a mega fever. Now, some of you get a fever and you're about 99.9, maybe 100. But what's a mega fever? A mega fever is when it climbs up to dangerous proportions, 103 and 104. And the tense of this verb, which is, none of you are probably interested much in Greek, but this is the imperfect tense, which means she's been in the grip of this fever for a long time. And she's spiraling down. You can only have a high fever for a certain amount of time. You need to get that thing down. So she's in the grip of a mega, severe fever. And they asked him concerning her. And, here's another word for stand. And he stood over her. When Mark writes this story, he doesn't mention the word stand once. Luke's already mentioned it twice. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever. Now that's odd, because he rebuked the demon. Now he rebukes the fever. Why? Why would he rebuke a fever? What do you reserve your rebukes for? Your buddies and your friends who are doing the right thing? What do you rebuke? Well, you may have to rebuke your cat. I can understand that. I encourage you to do that. A rebuke is for wrongdoing. And in Luke's mind, anything that keeps us from our humanity, our true humanity, and that keeps us from walking and walking with God, whether it's a demon or sickness, needs to be rebuked. And as the Son of God, he has the power and the authority to command even a major fever. And this is what he does. He rebuked the fever. And what happens? Well, I love what Luke does. Literally, it says, and the fever walked away. It left her. You see the emphasis on the walking? But here is the gold mine coming up here in just a minute. What happens? At once, what did she do? She stood up. And what? She began to serve. What's he doing? What's Luke doing? He's showing us the contrast between Jesus who stands and a human being who's suffering, who is not standing. until his presence comes and he rebukes the fever and she stands up. So Jesus puts this woman back on her feet. That's what Jesus has come to do for us. He has come to put us back on our feet. In a few minutes, I'm not sure of how long that's going to be, I want to talk about some of the various fevers that have captured people and keep them away and keep them in bed and keep them from serving and keep them from walking with God. There's all sorts of different fevers. As I understand the medical world, and I'm certainly not an expert, I'm at best an amateur, and the only reason I know a little bit about fevers is I've had fevers before. I remember one of my first weddings that I ever did, I had a fever. And it was when I first moved to Florida, and I must have picked up something that I had never been used to up in Canada, where it was usually cold and fevers don't have a chance to sneak in. But I picked up something, and I was weak and had a fever, and I was trying to do a wedding, and I was swaying back and forth. And I'm sure they thought, is he singing up there? Is he trying to do the moves up there? But some of you people know who I was marrying, so I won't mention their names. But it was a very weak and disconcerting feeling. I was afraid I was going to collapse. Well, there are a lot of fevers that entangle people in their lives. One of them is the fever of disillusionment with Christian leadership. Things happen. Things happen to parents. Things happen to teachers and coaches and pastors. Things happen to adults which disillusions the kids and their children and friends who see that. It can create real spiritual weakness so that these people just drop out of circulation. They drop out when they're at home, when they should be in the synagogue, like this woman. But she couldn't because she was weak. We're not criticizing anybody this morning. Jesus didn't come in and rebuke her, did he? He rebuked the fever. She contracted a fever in some way, which we don't know, which is not important. But I'll reserve my comments for a little bit later on, but only to help maybe spark in your mind someone who today is not on their feet and needs to be put back on their feet. How can we pray for them? How can we move into their life to bring them back to a position where they're standing on their feet, which is why God made us. We are homo erectus. We are made to stand on our feet and to serve. But let's move now to the next portion. It looks like it's not even connected at all, but it is. Here Jesus puts his hand on individual people. So the zoom lens of Luke's camera goes on Jesus' hands, and he heals all types of human weaknesses. Let's have a look at it. I'm at verse 40. Now, as the sun was sinking, do you see the irony there? Who just got up? The woman. She just stood up. And what's the sun doing? The sun is going down. It's sinking. Now, while the sun was sinking, everyone, as had relatives, I think is the idea. I've added that word to the narrative. It's not there. As many as had relatives who were weak and had various kinds of sicknesses, various kinds of illnesses, were led by them to him, to Jesus. Before we move on, it's important to understand from this passage that these people did not come on their own. They didn't walk themselves to Jesus. The sun sinking was the end of the Sabbath, which means now we no longer have to abide by the law of Moses, which said you can't walk over a half a mile on the Sabbath day, otherwise you break the law. As soon as the sun set, Sabbath is over with, and now I can walk further than a half a mile. And what happens? As the sun was sinking, everyone who had somebody, a friend, a relative, who had various kinds of illnesses and sicknesses, were led by them or carried by them to him. And here is the focus of the passage. If you want to look at the center of these two verses, here is what Luke tells us. He laid his hands on each one and healed them. The word is therapy. Therapusin. He healed them. So one dimension of Jesus as his role as the healing Son of God is that his hands became a hospital. His hands became a clinic. His hands exuded such power that the power flowed from his hands into weak bodies, sick bodies, and people who had cancer, people who had leukemia, people who had all sorts of illnesses were healed and healed instantly. Verse 41, though, he includes another dimension of our human nature. It's our mental nature. And I'm going to raise some controversy here by what I'm going to say, but hopefully I can squelch the controversy. And demons were coming out from many people, shouting and saying, "You are the Son of God!" And he rebuked them, just like he rebuked the favorite, and said to them to be quiet. He didn't allow them to speak because they knew all along, that he was the anointed one, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Christ. All right, Jesus does two things here. He puts his hand on individual people, first of all, who had physical illnesses and mental illnesses, caused in this passage by a demoniac or by a demon, some sort of unclean spirit. So Jesus is being depicted by Luke as the Son of God, the new Adam, who comes back to the promised land and does what the first Adam failed to do. What was Adam's first responsibility? He was to rule over the creation and all the creatures, which included the serpent, and he failed. Here, Jesus is shown to come back to that same promised land, and he encounters the same Satan, who has POW camps all over the place in Israel. Israel is supposed to be the promised land, but it's like one huge hospital, full of cripples, full of lepers, full of people demonized, full of sick people. Israel has become a hospital ward. Instead of a garden, yeah, it's an emergency room. And so Luke depicts Jesus as coming as the real, true, final Son of God, a Son of God in the same way that Adam was the Son of God. I know that's easy to get confused. We think when he says he's the Son of God, that speaks of his divinity. And I understand that, but the word Son of Man is the one that speaks of his divinity. Son of God speaks of his humanity. The replacement of Adam, who comes to the garden, which has become a hospital, and he shows his power over everything that afflicts us, including fevers and demons and physical sicknesses. Now, I'm not saying that every mental illness, or even, in fact, that any mental illness is caused by demons. I don't think that's a fair connection, but in some way, this demon has affected people's mental abilities, and it has taken the stroke of Jesus' command, his rebuke, to heal all these people. But the focus of the passage is on Jesus' personal touch. It was his hands that not only healed people, but it was his hands that caused the demons to be expelled. And they came out basically with their cry of surrender. You are the Son of God. Why for us? Let me share a few of them. God made us to serve. God made us to stand up and to serve. And I would encourage you to consider that if God has healed you of a fever, of some kind of a fever, that you ought to consider doing what this woman did. This nameless woman, this mother-in-law of Pete, is to start serving. Look for ways that you can be a blessing to people. Look for ways to use your hands to serve. Look for ways to relieve misery in people's lives, like this woman did. There are various kinds of fevers that crawl into our lives. Boy fever, Saturday night fever, girl fever. Christianity is not hermits and monasteries. Christianity is not priests in cloisters. We do not shun the battles of life. We live our lives out on the streets and in the homes and in the offices and the hospitals and the shops of our lives. If Jesus has put us back on our feet, then look for ways to serve him. True Christianity is to be demonstrated where we live and where we work. The second thing I notice about this woman as she displays her Christianity is that this woman displays her Christianity at home. If our kids are not convinced that we are genuine believers, I doubt if anybody else is convinced either. The best Christianity is the Christianity that works at home. Howard Hendricks used to say to us, if it doesn't work at home, don't export it. It doesn't work. There should be clear evidence in our homes and in our relationships, our marriages, and in the way we deal with each other, that our Christianity is a Christianity that first works at home. If it doesn't work at home, it doesn't work. Something else that I noticed about this woman is that no one asked this woman to do anything. Jesus didn't turn to her and say, now start working. It was on her own, without command, without orders, without delay. No one forced it on her. She saw people, she saw the need, she had strength from this fever which she had been healed from immediately, which is really unusual. If I have a fever, it takes a long time for me to regain my strength, but not this lady. She used the strength that she had to get to work immediately without being told to do. But finally, and I think most encouragingly, this passage shows us that Jesus has an individual personal interest in everyone here. That when Jesus healed people, it wasn't a mass healing. He didn't walk into the crowd, raise his hands and say, all right, everybody's healed. Luke takes the time to tell us that the healing here was individual. He placed his hands on every single person. And that's what I love about Christianity, is that it's very, very personal. Our names, as I understand it, are written on our high priest's hands. I know they're big hands to get all those names on there. Must have been using a rapidograph, a architect's pen, to get all our names on his hands. But Christianity is individual. And if you have a fever today, some kind of a fever that keeps you away, some kind of a fever that has kept you from serving, I would suggest to you that you ask Jesus to come and lay his hands on you and restore your strength and restore the spirit of service. He'll come to you individually. He knows your name. He knows the fever that you've got. He knows the sickness that you've got. He won't just treat you from a distance and say, hey, he'll come to your bedside and put his hands on you. I'd ask you to ask him to do that. Now, there may be someone in your life that's still in bed spiritually. They're not walking with God. They are homo erectus, but they are not walking with him and not being a blessing to other people. Ask Jesus to go to them, place his hands upon them, and to heal them. Why don't you ask Jesus about that person, just like these people asked him about Simon's mother-in-law? I believe Jesus will hear you and go lay his hands on someone that needs to have their hands laid on. We've said two things this morning. That Jesus puts us back on our feet. And he puts his hands on individual people, healing them of all types of human weaknesses and sins. And he'll do that for us, and he will do that for you. Who comes to your mind? Let's do this for a minute. Let's stand and pray together as a community. And right now, as we stand, let's ask God right now. Let's ask Jesus right now to place his hands on somebody. Stand and let's pray for them. And then the worship team will come and sing. Right now, ask God. Ask Jesus to go and place his hands on that individual, that daughter of yours, that son of yours, that spouse, that child, that grandparent, that neighbor, that co-worker. They've got a fever of discontent, bitterness, unforgiveness. disillusionment with Christianity, angry, and they're in bed spiritually. Take a moment and ask Jesus to go place his hands upon them and make his presence known to him. In the quietness of this hour, plead that Jesus will do that. It may be you that has the fever. Thank you, Lord, for bringing to mind people that are today in bed spiritually. We don't criticize them. We don't sit in judgment. But you brought them to mind. We ask you to hear every prayer here. Every prayer. Your hands are big enough and long enough to reach out and touch even the sickest and the weakest and the lowest. Let us hear in days to come of how they've been raised. They've been healed of their fever, and they are walking, and they are serving. Let us hear that, and we'll give you the praise for Jesus' sake. Worship team. Time for questions. You may see it. A couple of questions, maybe. I'll try to give you some answers. Am I back on here?
Yes, sir. There you go.
All right, thank you. Anybody have a question about something that I might have not have said, or something that I did say that piqued your interest? Before Katie comes and gives us some announcements, and then David Dare will do the same. Anybody? Comment? Yeah, comment. Sure, comments are allowed. We have a hand here and a hand here. Yes, you'd like to volunteer and serve, right? No.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just Kevin, if you can lift your voice up enough for all of us to hear, it probably won't be a problem.
Do you know if it is important that we know whether someone is afflicted bodily or spiritually? Is the prayer for that person the same? Is it important to discern at all between them?
It's a good question. I think what Luke has done here in this passage is to blend them together. And so that when we pray, we can kind of leave it to God's sovereignty whether this is caused by something spiritual or whether it's simply a physical ailment. So, as I understand the way the passage is juxtaposed together seamlessly, we are to pray that God would heal them of that fever, of whatever it is, and that God sort out what's at the root. Yeah, good question. There was a question here.
So, last week you discussed that in Acts, it's the fifth gospel of Jesus continuing his work by giving his spirit to his leaders. And then Peter and then Paul both healed somebody in Jesus' name, right?
Yep.
So, is our only kind of duty now to pray for them? Or does the Spirit use people like he used Peter and Paul to lay a hand on somebody?
Did everybody hear the question? Let's see. Joshua, did you hear the question? You're far enough back. Did you hear the question?
Yeah.
I can't hear you. You heard the question. And that's what's important. Yes, I'm going to digress here a little bit. It's my judgment that my interpretation of the way Acts is constructed and composed is that in answer to the question, well, Peter, he's going to die one day, and Paul's going to die. They don't last forever. Who takes over from them? And he writes Acts 20 in such a way to show that the successors to Peter and Paul are the elders of the church. And it is the elders who carry on the work of the apostles. This is why in James chapter 5, he calls for people who are sick, what? To call for who? The elders of the church, and to anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord, and to pray for healing. This is what we do, and we've seen the Lord heal many, many people. So, yes, is my answer to your question. We are to continue the work that we see going on in the book of the Acts. Maybe not to the same extent as raising the dead
But
and giving the Spirit, but we'll leave that up to God. Yeah, truly, Peter and Paul, I think, are unique. They're unique and probably not to be reproduced. And the big thing, the difference between Peter and Paul and other elders is what? They saw Jesus. They were eyewitnesses of Jesus. Jesus appeared to Saul in Acts 9. And of course, Peter saw Jesus after his resurrection. We haven't, unless one of the elders here had a secret meeting, but Jesus had failed to tell us about it and captured it on video. All right, I hope I answered your question. Yeah, time for one more. Yes, Jennifer.
As Christians, we are encouraged to pray for one another, especially when the other party is in distress. Now, how do you respond to a fellow Christian who say the prayer is unspoken prayer? It's unspoken. So when there's no specific.
How do you pray for that?
Yeah.
Do you have a suggestion yourself?
I feel that it's hard to pray for unspoken prayer, maybe once, but if from the same individual it's happening all the time, I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, I hear your burden. How many heard the question? Have you ever asked people to pray for an unspoken request and you keep hearing it year and year and year and year after year? I have no recollection of ever coming across an unspoken prayer request in the scriptures. I can't find any of those. So it's a new category. I would encourage people who have this unspoken request to actually bear the burden, if possible, and to share it and be specific so that we can join them in not giving shotgun prayers, but 30-06 prayers, a single bullet rather than a blast. Do you understand that? A little bit more focused. Sorry for the analogy. It may be out of place, but it's the one that came to my mind. Yeah, all right. That's it. All right, Katie, would you welcome Katie? Katie's going to tell us what's going on and how to behave. Welcome, Katie.
I don't know if I can have any effect on your behavior, but, be good. Jesse, quick question. We want, obviously, to keep our area in the chapel better than the way that we found it. We've been meeting now for a few weeks. Is there anything that you can think of specifically that maybe we have overlooked that might make your job a little bit easier? Is there anything that you can think of?
No, you're fine.
All right, well, great job then, everybody. Keep cleaning up, obviously, like we've said. We want to leave it better than the way that we found it because we want to be good stewards of the place that's been given. Also, our family potluck's coming up the second Sunday. Also, Kathy Carroll's baby shower, June 22nd. I believe it's up there. Yeah, it's up there. She also wanted me to let you guys know that she is registered online at Amazon, and obviously this is their first, so they're going to need a lot of stuff as a first mom and first parents. But she's registered under her name, and that's Kathy with a K and Carol with 2 R's and 2 L's. And then also, we are officially on Facebook, and we're online, and so you have different ways to give. We still have our box that you can donate. Pastor has it, obviously. And I think David's also coming to speak more on that, I believe, as well. So, thank you.
All right, so hopefully this is the last Sunday that I need to make a business type announcement. Last Sunday I talked to you guys all. We're trying to be as transparent as possible regarding the start of this new church, this new ministry, and we especially want to be transparent with anything that's related to finances. So with that being said, last Sunday I said that everything should be squared away by this Sunday. I was wrong. As some of you guys know who've started your own businesses or have done different things in the business, there's always more hoops to seemingly jump through. So we found out that there were a couple more hoops to jump through, which we hope to be able to jump through this week, so that next week everything should be set up accordingly. So what that means, if you have given through the box, like the little box that we have in the back, we are just hoarding that, waiting to put that in our account. So we hope to be able to put that in the account this week. So if you have written a check, that just means that it hasn't been deposited yet, and it should be deposited this week. And I apologize for that inconvenience. That would probably rest on me as my fault, so sorry. If you would like more information, you can see me individually. I'd love to talk to you. Second big item that I mentioned last week, we had talked about the fact that we have to go through the process of getting a 501c3 for our tax-exempt status. That is a process that's going to take longer than a week. It'll probably take 2 to 3 months. We have it on good authority, but I'm a very cautious person, so I would like to reaffirm this before I, make this official, that once we apply for the 501(c)(3) and get it, everything would revert back to the start of our organization or to the start of the application, as long as it's within 23 months. Some of you are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. All this means is that once we start the application, if you give during that time, you can revert it back as tax exempt as long as it is within 23 months, which it will be. But because, like I said, I'm really cautious, I would like to make very, very certain of that before any of you give who are in that situation who would meet your exemption requirements. So again, sorry for the business side of it. We'd encourage all of you to give as you feel led. We have an opportunity to get ahead, which I've talked about a few times now, and we would like to seize that opportunity and be good stewards. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to come and speak to me. I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. And it's great to see the Crows here this morning with us, Celeste and Aaron Crow. Raise your hand. Let's welcome them this morning. Good to see you. Welcome. We're going to finish with a blessing. It's the very well-known blessing from Numbers 6. So go ahead and stand and we'll get ready. Just a little anecdote about it. My brother Bob, I have many, many brothers. And my brother Bob is a Hebrew professor and reads the Old Testament text like an English primer. He has a class that he teaches around the world on Saturday mornings, and I joined it yesterday. He has students from everywhere, Africa, Asia, South America, and Great Britain, and from the South here in the States. And so I joined it. At the end of the class, we were going through 1 Samuel 17. We're really going through at a fast clip. We did one verse in an hour. So, yeah, pretty fast. And at the end of the class, he said, "Now, Tim, we want you to close in prayer. It's my first time in class." So I said, "How about if I do the blessing?" They'd never heard of that before. So I'm going to ask you not to be too shocked by the blessing this morning. Just take it in stride, all right? It's number 6. Yes, yes, yes. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you. Yes, turn his face towards you and his hands towards you and give you shalom. Let God's people say,
Amen.
You are dismissed.